The world was once vibrant, filled with bustling cities, thriving communities, and the hum of technology that connected millions of people. But all of that seemed like a distant memory now, a fading echo of a time when humanity had control over its destiny. The day the outbreak began, no one truly understood what was coming. News reports spoke of strange viral infections, but they were dismissed as isolated incidents until it was too late. Jason Malone, an ordinary man with an unremarkable life, had been at work when the first signs of the apocalypse began to unfold. He was an office clerk in a high-rise building in downtown Los Angeles, where his life consisted of endless spreadsheets, coffee breaks, and the occasional after-hours happy hour. He never saw himself as a hero or a survivor. In fact, he was just trying to get by, day by day, always dreaming of a better future, one that now seemed unreachable. It began with rumors. At first, they were whispers, strange attacks, people acting violently, then disappearing. But no one thought much of it. It wasn't until the mass panic began that Jason realized the magnitude of what was happening. That morning, as he made his way to the office, the usual calmness of the city had been replaced with an unnerving stillness. There was an odd tension in the air, and the streets were strangely quiet. He assumed it was just an early morning rush, but as he passed by a newsstand, he saw a headline that made his stomach drop: "Zombies on the loose, city under quarantine." Jason froze for a moment. He had laughed at the idea of zombies before, popularized by movies, TV shows, and video games, but seeing the word on a newsprint made his blood run cold. He pulled out his phone, frantically scrolling through social media, trying to make sense of what was going on. The posts were filled with chaos, people reporting violent attacks, looting, and strange behavior from their neighbors. And then, just as quickly, the posts stopped coming. A sudden scream broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of sirens. Jason glanced up to see a group of people running, their faces twisted in terror. They didn't look like they were fleeing from a robbery or a protest. It was something far worse. He saw one man trip, falling to the ground as several others surged past him. That's when Jason noticed the figures chasing them. The creatures were unlike anything he had ever seen. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their faces pale and contorted in grotesque masks of hunger. Their eyes were vacant, devoid of any humanity. The sound of gnashing teeth reached Jason's ears as he stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before him. He watched in horror as the creatures descended upon the man on the ground, ripping into his flesh with a ferocity that made his stomach turn. His legs finally moved, instinct taking over as he darted into an alleyway, trying to find safety. His heart pounded in his chest as the sounds of chaos grew louder around him. People screamed, gunshots rang out in the distance, and the world that had once seemed so secure was now a war zone. He knew he needed to find shelter, and fast. Jason's mind raced as he navigated the empty streets. The government had declared a state of emergency, but it seemed like no one was in control anymore. Cell towers were down, the internet was a dead zone, and the radio broadcasts were filled with panicked voices, urging people to stay indoors. But how could he stay indoors when the world outside had become a hunting ground? It wasn't until he reached the underground subway station that he realized how alone he truly was. The platform was eerily silent, save for the occasional distant noise echoing from the surface. Jason hurried down the stairs, hoping to find some kind of shelter below. The train was long gone, and the station had been abandoned, but it offered the only hope of safety he had. He knew he couldn't stay in the open any longer. As he explored the underground tunnels, his footsteps reverberated off the cold concrete walls. He could hear faint sounds of others in the distance, screams, crashes, the sound of a city slowly crumbling. Jason found a small alcove near a maintenance door and ducked into it, hoping to catch his breath. But his mind kept racing. What had happened to the world? How had things deteriorated so quickly? And more importantly, would he survive long enough to find out? For the first time in hours, Jason allowed himself to close his eyes, letting the overwhelming fear and exhaustion take over. The thought of the creatures above, their twisted, hungry faces, made it hard to sleep. But he knew he needed rest if he was going to make it through the days ahead. Jason's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He tensed, his heart racing once again. Had the undead found their way underground? Was he about to be their next meal? His hand instinctively reached for a metal pipe lying nearby, the only weapon within reach. The footsteps grew louder, and he prepared for the worst, not knowing whether he was about to face the living or the dead. Jason held his breath as the footsteps echoed closer, each step reverberating through the dimly lit subway tunnel. His fingers tightened around the metal pipe, the cold steel feeling like his only lifeline in this dark, chaotic world. He peered out from his hiding spot in the alcove, trying to stay as silent as possible, his heart thundering in his chest. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, Jason knew he couldn't afford to be seen. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, there was only the distant sound of the wind howling through the tunnel. Jason's mind raced. Could it be another survivor? Or was it one of the creatures, drawn by the scent of living flesh? Just as Jason began to exhale, a voice cut through the silence, low and strained, but undeniably human. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Jason froze. The voice sounded desperate, but not panicked, calm yet trembling with the weight of fear. He didn't want to reveal his position just yet. There was a chance this person could be a threat. He had learned quickly that trust in this new world was a dangerous thing. The old world had been full of rules, social norms, and respect for life. Now, survival was the only rule. Another voice followed, this one louder and more urgent. "Please, we need help. We're not infected. Please, we..." Jason didn't wait to hear more. He stepped out of the alcove and into the shadowed tunnel, his heart pounding as he moved cautiously toward the voices. His mind ran through 1,000 scenarios. What if they were part of a gang? What if they had already been infected? What if they had a hidden agenda, a trap set to lure in the unprepared? He slowed his pace, listening carefully. The voices were growing louder, a mixture of female and male voices, pleading, but still holding on to hope. It sounded like they were only a few yards away. When Jason finally rounded the corner, he came face to face with two people. A man and a woman, both in their late 20s, ragged and dirty, but their eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and relief. They looked human, thankfully, but that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. In fact, Jason's gut told him not to trust anyone, not yet. But there was something in their eyes that made him hesitate, something that mirrored the fear he felt every moment since the outbreak. The man, with short-cropped brown hair and a torn jacket, took a step forward, cautiously. "We're not infected. We just need somewhere safe to hide. Please, we saw the things upstairs. They're everywhere. Please, can we..." Jason raised a hand to stop him, his voice low but firm. "Keep your distance. I don't know if I can trust you yet." The woman, dark-haired and disheveled, glanced at the man, then back at Jason. Her voice was quiet but pleading. "We're just trying to survive, like you. We didn't ask for this. Please, we don't have anywhere else to go." Jason considered their words carefully. The world above was no longer safe, and the tunnels, though dark and ominous, offered a temporary shelter from the undead roaming the surface. But the deeper he ventured into this underground maze, the more it felt like they were trapped in a cage of their own. The tension between safety and isolation was overwhelming. "How do I know you're not lying?" Jason asked, his grip tightening around the pipe. "How do I know you won't turn on me the first chance you get?" The man swallowed hard. "We're not like them. We're not infected." He hesitated, glancing at the woman beside him. She nodded faintly, adding, "We just want to stay alive. If we're together, we'll have a better chance." Jason's eyes scanned them both carefully. He noticed the exhaustion in their faces, the weariness in their movements. They had been running for a while. They were survivors, just like him. But trusting others was a gamble in a world where the living could be just as dangerous as the dead. He let out a slow breath, lowering the pipe just slightly. "All right, you can stay. But don't try anything stupid." The woman gave a soft, grateful smile. "Thank you." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jason allowed himself to relax, just a little. They weren't a threat, not yet. He could hear the faint sounds of movement from further down the tunnel, but nothing close enough to raise alarm. Jason motioned for them to follow. "There's a small room a few hundred yards ahead. It's not much, but it's safe for now. We'll figure out what to do next." They nodded, and together, they moved through the labyrinth of tunnels, the darkness enveloping them as they pressed forward. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty space, amplifying the isolation that seemed to follow them everywhere. Jason's thoughts kept circling back to the world above, how everything had crumbled so quickly, how people had turned into monsters. He wasn't sure how long it had been since the outbreak started, but every day felt like a lifetime. As they reached the small room, they saw it was just a storage area, filled with old crates and metal shelving units. It wasn't ideal, but it was secure. The woman immediately collapsed onto the ground, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. The man sat next to her, his face grim. Jason leaned against the far wall, silently watching them both. He wasn't sure if he could trust them fully, but he couldn't keep running alone. He needed allies, even if they were strangers. "What's your name?" Jason asked, breaking the silence. The man looked up, his eyes tired but sincere. "I'm Luke. This is Sarah." Jason nodded. "I'm Jason. And right now, that's all we have, our names. We survive together, or we die alone." The words hung in the air like a weight. Jason wasn't sure how long they would all make it. But in that moment, he realized something important: survival wasn't just about fighting the undead. It was about holding on to the small, fragile connections that remained. And in this new world, that might just be enough. The underground room was as cold as it was silent. The hum of distant machinery from the city above was a faint reminder of the world that had once been, of normality that felt like a lifetime ago. Jason sat on the ground, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, his eyes darting between Luke and Sarah. They were exhausted, their bodies slumped as they leaned against the crates, both of them clearly on the edge of collapse. It had been a long day of running, hiding, and barely escaping the horrors lurking above. Jason, however, couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at him. He hadn't expected to find other survivors so soon, and though they seemed harmless, the truth was that no one could be trusted, not in this world. Luke cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I think we should figure out our next move. We can't stay here forever." Jason glanced up at him, his expression unreadable. "You're right. But we're safe for now. The last thing we need is to draw attention by wandering around aimlessly." Sarah, who had been quietly rubbing her eyes, looked up at them both. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We can't stay in the tunnels forever, either. There has to be somewhere better, somewhere we can survive longer." Jason hesitated. They were right. They couldn't stay hidden away in this dingy storage room indefinitely, but the world above was no safer. Every day, the undead seemed to grow more numerous, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't eventually find their way down into these tunnels. "Tomorrow, we'll scout the area," Jason said, his voice steady. "We'll look for resources, food, water, maybe a more secure location. But we have to be careful. We can't afford to make noise, and we can't trust anyone we meet out there." Luke nodded. "Agreed. We can't be too reckless." The group fell into an uneasy silence as the night stretched on. Time seemed to lose meaning in the darkness of the tunnel. Jason found himself unable to sleep, his mind constantly racing. The fear of the unknown kept him awake. What had caused this? Was it a virus, some kind of weaponized disease? And what had happened to the rest of the world? The isolation was suffocating, and each hour felt like it dragged on endlessly. Eventually, the weight of exhaustion overcame him, and his eyelids fluttered shut. But even in sleep, his dreams were haunted by images of the undead, those grotesque, rotting figures stalking through a world he no longer recognized. Jason awoke to the sound of scraping, a low, almost imperceptible noise coming from the far side of the room. His heart lurched as he snapped awake, reaching instinctively for the metal pipe he had left by his side. His breath caught in his throat as he scanned the dark room, straining his ears to catch any sound that might hint at what had disturbed the silence. Beside him, Luke stirred. "What's going on?" Jason held up a hand to silence him, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the noise. It was faint, but it was definitely there, scraping, shuffling, like something was moving in the dark. "Stay quiet," Jason whispered urgently. Sarah was now awake, her face pale in the dim light. "What is it?" she asked in a hushed voice, her eyes wide with fear. Jason's pulse quickened. He couldn't tell if it was the undead or something worse, but they had to be ready. They couldn't let their guard down, not even for a second. Luke, who had grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor, motioned for Jason to follow. They both crept toward the source of the noise, moving as quietly as possible. Every step felt like an eternity as they reached the far end of the room. Jason leaned around the corner, his grip tightening on the pipe. What he saw made his stomach turn. A single zombie, its pale skin nearly translucent in the low light, was scratching at the door of the storage room. Its fingers were twisted and deformed, broken at odd angles as it clawed at the metal surface. The creature's eyes were dull, glazed over, but it still seemed driven by a single, primal need, hunger. Jason's breath hitched. He had seen one before, but in the chaos above, he hadn't fully understood the terror these creatures could inspire until now. The zombie groaned, low and guttural, as it scratched the door again, the metal screeching under its touch. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. Jason motioned for Luke to take a step back. "We need to stay as quiet as possible. If it hears us." Luke nodded, backing away slowly. They needed to outlast this creature, to wait until it either lost interest or left. But they couldn't afford to move too quickly. Every sound would draw it closer. Minutes passed like hours. The creature continued to scrape, its breath ragged and hoarse as it snuffled at the door. Jason held his breath, every muscle tense as the zombie's claws raked over the metal, sending a chill down his spine. Just when Jason thought his nerves would snap, the zombie suddenly stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Jason's heartbeat pounding in his ears. He barely dared to move. Then, without warning, the creature shuffled away, its footsteps growing fainter until they were gone entirely. Jason let out a long, slow breath of relief. They had survived the first real test of their survival. "That was too close," Luke muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Jason nodded, his eyes still fixed on the door. "We can't keep relying on luck. We need to find a way to secure this place before we move on." Sarah, still visibly shaken, nodded silently. "How long before we leave?" "Tomorrow morning," Jason replied. "We need daylight to move safely. We'll get the supplies we need, and we'll keep our distance from the undead." As they settled back into their makeshift camp, the terror of the near-miss still fresh in their minds, Jason knew this was just the beginning. They had to stay vigilant, one wrong move, one slip-up, and they could all end up like the creatures they were so desperately trying to avoid. Tomorrow would be a new day, but it wouldn't be without its dangers. They were still very far from safe. The next morning came slowly, the dim light filtering through the cracks in the subway tunnel like a faint, fleeting hope. The air felt stale, heavy with the weight of the previous night's events. Jason awoke first, his body stiff from sleeping on the cold concrete floor, but his mind was sharp. He knew that they couldn't stay here much longer. The zombies' close call had made that much clear. They needed to move, find food, water, and most importantly, find something more secure than this crumbling underground bunker. He shook off the fatigue that still clung to him and stood up, stretching as quietly as he could. He needed to keep his senses alert. In this new world, any moment could turn deadly. Luke and Sarah were still asleep, curled up in their respective corners. Jason felt a pang of sympathy for them. They had been through so much, and he knew it wasn't just their bodies that were worn down, it was their spirits. This world had a way of breaking people, of stripping away hope until nothing but survival instincts remained. He quietly made his way to the corner of the room where they had stored their small supply of water and any food they had scavenged. It wasn't much, just a few cans of beans, some bottled water, and a half-eaten granola bar. But in a world where the shelves were empty and the markets were a memory, it would have to do for now. He had to keep his mind focused on the next step, on finding more. Luke stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He groaned, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "What time is it?" "Early," Jason replied, his voice calm. "We should move before the undead come back through the tunnels." Sarah woke shortly after, and the three of them gathered their things. They had a few weapons, a pipe, a crowbar, and the broken piece of wood Luke had been using, but none of them were particularly confident in their abilities to fight. The undead were relentless, and no matter how prepared they were, they knew it wouldn't be enough to keep them safe forever. Jason led the way, checking for signs of movement before stepping into the main tunnel. The stillness of the underground was unnerving, but it was also a blessing. There were no groaning creatures to be heard, no distant footsteps of danger approaching. For now, they had the upper hand. They made their way toward the subway station's exit, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As they walked, Jason's mind raced through their plan. They would check nearby buildings for supplies, keeping a low profile. They couldn't afford to make noise, not when the undead could be lurking just around the corner. Luke spoke up as they neared the stairs leading up to street level. "What if there's a better place we can go? Maybe a hospital or a police station. They'd have supplies, right?" Jason thought about it. He wasn't sure if it was worth the risk. Hospitals and police stations would be prime targets for survivors, and the chance of finding them overrun with zombies was high. But Luke was right, they needed more supplies, and they couldn't survive on what little they had for much longer. "We'll check the area around the station first," Jason said, glancing up at the cracked glass above the stairwell. "If it's too risky, we'll move on." They climbed the stairs carefully, stepping lightly, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of the undead. The higher they climbed, the stronger the stench of decay became, thickening in the stale air. The city above was eerily quiet, the usual noise of traffic and human activity replaced by an unsettling stillness. Jason took a deep breath, steeling himself for what they might find. The door to the subway station creaked open, revealing the world outside. It was a wasteland. The city had been abandoned, the streets littered with debris, abandoned cars, and the remnants of a once thriving society. Windows were shattered, storefronts looted, and the signs of chaos were everywhere. The sky was gray, overcast with smoke from distant fires, and there was no sign of life, except for the occasional scavenger, and more ominously, the slow shuffle of zombies in the distance. Jason scanned the streets, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. He could see some movement in the distance, figures shambling through the streets, their decayed forms barely recognizable as human anymore. Some were grouped together, while others wandered aimlessly. There was no pattern to their movement, just the constant, relentless hunger that drove them forward. "There are a lot of them," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. Jason nodded. "We'll stick to the edges of the streets, avoid open areas. Stay quiet." They moved cautiously, hugging the sides of buildings, moving from cover to cover, careful not to draw attention. Every corner felt like it could be their last. Jason's senses were on high alert, every muscle in his body tensed, ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger. After what felt like hours of silent movement, they found a small convenience store that had been broken into, its shelves picked clean. But there were still a few things left, a few bottles of water, some bags of chips, and a couple of cans of soup. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jason motioned for the others to stay low as he entered the store. He quickly grabbed what he could and shoved it into his backpack. But before they could leave, a sudden noise stopped him in his tracks. A low growl echoed from the alleyway behind the store. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He motioned for Luke and Sarah to stay still, holding his breath as he crouched low behind a shelf. The growl was joined by more, and the sound of feet shuffling against the pavement grew louder. The undead were close. Too close. Jason's mind raced. They couldn't fight them all off, there were too many. But they had no choice. He looked at Luke and Sarah, his face hardening. "We need to move, now," Jason whispered urgently. They made a break for it, darting through the back door of the store, barely managing to avoid a group of zombies stumbling through the alley. As they ran, Jason's mind kept replaying the same thought. Every day, they were getting closer to running out of time. Survival was no longer just about finding food and water, it was about outlasting the undead, outsmarting them, and always staying one step ahead. Because in this new world, there was no room for hesitation. One mistake, and they would be the ones on the other side, chasing after the living. Jason couldn't afford to let that happen. Not yet. The city was a maze of broken buildings and abandoned streets. After narrowly escaping the undead in the alley, Jason, Luke, and Sarah made their way down a narrow side street, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the cracked pavement. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the distant groans of zombies and the occasional crash of something falling somewhere in the distance. Jason glanced over his shoulder, still feeling the weight of the close call. His breath was ragged from running, but he forced himself to stay focused. They had enough supplies for now, but it wasn't enough to ensure long-term survival. They needed a place to lay low, somewhere safe where they could regroup and plan their next move. "We should keep moving," Jason said, his voice low. "We can't afford to stop for too long." Luke nodded, but his face showed signs of exhaustion. They had been walking for hours, and their pace had slowed. The weight of what they were enduring was starting to wear on them. The constant fear, the uncertainty, it was all taking its toll. But Luke didn't argue. He knew Jason was right. As they continued down the street, they passed what used to be a small park. The grass was overgrown, and the swings hung lifeless, swaying slightly in the wind. Jason stopped for a moment, his eyes scanning the area. There was a large building ahead, a once proud hotel that still stood tall amidst the decay. Its windows were shattered, and its once beautiful entrance was now a crumbling mess, but it still looked like it could offer shelter. "Over there," Jason said, pointing toward the hotel. "We can check it out." The group moved cautiously toward the entrance. Jason kept his hand on the crowbar he had taken from the convenience store, his eyes constantly scanning for movement. They knew the undead could be anywhere. Every corner, every building, could harbor danger. They approached the front doors of the hotel. The glass had been shattered, but the frame still seemed intact. Jason pushed one of the doors open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. He motioned for Luke and Sarah to follow him inside. The lobby was eerily quiet, the faint smell of mildew and decay hanging in the air. Broken furniture lay scattered around the room, remnants of what had once been a bustling hotel lobby. The reception desk was overturned, and papers were strewn across the floor. But most notably, there were no signs of zombies. Jason carefully stepped forward, his eyes darting around, looking for any signs of movement. There was nothing. The place seemed abandoned, emptied out long ago by either survivors or the undead. "We need to clear this place out," Jason said. "It's too big to just settle in without checking it." Luke and Sarah nodded, and they began to move deeper into the building, checking the rooms on the lower floors. They found the first few floors empty, just as desolate as the lobby, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The stairs creaked beneath their feet as they ascended to the higher floors, moving cautiously from door to door. It wasn't until they reached the fourth floor that they found something, another survivor. The man was sitting in a chair near one of the windows, his back to them. His clothes were dirty, and his face was gaunt, but he didn't seem to be one of the undead. He didn't turn when he heard their footsteps, but Jason wasn't sure if he was even aware they were there. It wasn't uncommon for survivors to go into a kind of shock or isolation, but Jason didn't take chances. "Hey," Jason called softly, not wanting to startle him. "Are you okay?" The man turned slowly, his face expressionless. His eyes were bloodshot, and his lips were cracked. But when he saw the group, his expression shifted to one of wariness. He didn't move, just stared at them as if unsure of whether to trust them. Jason raised his hands in a calming gesture. "We're not here to hurt you." We're just looking for a place to rest. We'll leave if you want us to. The man said nothing for a long moment, his gaze flickering between Jason, Luke, and Sarah. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice hoarse and barely audible. You can stay, but I don't trust you. Jason nodded. He didn't blame the man. In this world, trust was a luxury few could afford. We just need a place to stay for a while, Jason said. We're not staying long. We're just looking for shelter. The man didn't respond immediately, but his gaze softened a little, as if he was weighing their words. Finally, he nodded slowly. There's a supply closet down the hall, he said, his voice almost too quiet to hear. You can rest there, but you'll have to keep quiet. Jason gave a silent nod of gratitude. The man didn't seem like he was in any condition to offer much help, but he could still be a valuable ally, if only they could gain his trust. They moved cautiously to the supply closet the man had mentioned, which was a small, dark room just off the main hallway. Inside, they found some spare blankets, a few old bottled waters, and a couple of cans of food. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going for a few more days. As they settled in, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. They were safe, for now, but every moment in this world felt like a countdown. The zombies, the dangers from other survivors, and the unpredictable future, they were all constant threats. Let's get some rest, Jason said quietly. We'll be out of here tomorrow. No matter how safe this place seems, we can't afford to stay here too long. They lay down in the dark, the silence of the hotel pressing in on them. Jason's thoughts drifted to the future. How long would they last? Would they find a place to truly settle down, or would they always be on the run? He didn't have an answer, but as his eyes closed, he knew one thing for certain: tomorrow would be just as dangerous as today. And they would have to be ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Jason awoke to the soft sounds of movement in the supply closet. It took a moment for his mind to fully register the change in his surroundings. His body was sore from the uncomfortable position he had slept in, but the exhaustion was worse than the discomfort. He stretched his arms slowly, careful not to disturb the others, and listened for any signs of danger. The only sound was the distant groaning of the undead echoing through the building, but it was far off, not close enough to pose an immediate threat. Luke was still asleep, his head resting against the wall, and Sarah lay on the floor beside him, curled up tightly. The small space was cramped, but they had made do, and Jason couldn't afford to be picky anymore. They were alive, and that was all that mattered. He stood up quietly and made his way to the door, pushing it open just a crack to peer outside. The hallway was empty, no zombies, no signs of movement. The man they had found the previous day had retreated to a room down the hall, and Jason hadn't seen him since. His instinct told him the stranger wasn't someone to be trusted easily, but they needed all the help they could get in this desolate world. Taking a deep breath, Jason stepped out into the hallway, moving cautiously toward the stairwell. The hotel was still quiet, and it gave him the sense that it was as much a trap as it was a refuge. But they had to take the risk, there was no other choice. They needed supplies, and they needed to figure out their next move. As he descended the stairs, Jason's mind raced. They were low on food and water again, and despite the brief reprieve they had found, the reality of their situation hadn't changed. Trust was a luxury, but it was necessary in a world where survival depended on cooperation. He just didn't know how much he could trust the man they had found, and that unsettled him. By the time he reached the lobby, Luke and Sarah had joined him, both looking more awake but still clearly on edge. They knew as well as Jason that every moment of peace was temporary. The threat of the undead, the scarcity of resources, and the danger from other survivors loomed over them all. "We need to go out," Jason said, turning to his companions. "The supplies we found here won't last forever. We can't just sit in here and wait for something to happen." Luke nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "What about him?" he asked, glancing toward the room where the stranger had been. "He could be a threat, right?" Jason nodded. "We keep an eye on him. We don't know if he's with anyone else. If it comes down to it, we handle it. But for now, let's focus on what we need. As they stepped into the lobby, the tension was thick. The stranger had left his room, but he was nowhere to be seen. Jason's pulse quickened as he scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. But the hotel was still eerily silent. "Where the hell is he?" Sarah whispered, her voice tense with unease. Jason wasn't sure. He didn't like this. The silence felt unnatural, as though they were walking into a trap. But there was no turning back now. They had to keep moving. "Stay sharp," Jason murmured. "We check the area, grab what we can, and get out." They moved cautiously through the lobby, making their way toward the back exit. Jason paused at the door, listening for any sound that might indicate an incoming threat. The city outside was still and quiet, with only the occasional shuffle of zombies in the distance. It felt like the calm before a storm. They stepped outside, moving into the alley behind the hotel. The world had changed so much in such a short time. Once bustling streets were now desolate, filled only with the sounds of the undead and the occasional gust of wind. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a constant reminder of how quickly civilization had crumbled. They moved quietly, sticking to the edges of the alley as they made their way toward a nearby grocery store. Jason's mind was still on the stranger from the hotel. If he could get back to the hotel before they did, there was a chance he could trap them there, or worse, sell them out to other survivors, or worse yet, the zombies. They reached the grocery store, and Jason felt a sense of urgency building in him. They had to be quick. He pushed the door open slowly, scanning the interior for any immediate threats. The store was dark, the shelves mostly bare. But in the back, they spotted a few cans of food that hadn't been looted. "Let's grab what we can," Jason said, his voice low. Luke nodded and went to the canned goods aisle, while Sarah stayed close to Jason, keeping an eye on the entrance. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a second. Just as Jason reached for a can of soup, he heard a noise behind him, a soft shuffle. His heart raced as he turned to face the sound, his hand gripping the crowbar. But when he saw the figure, his blood ran cold. It was the stranger from the hotel. The man stood in the doorway of the store, his eyes narrowed, his expression hard. He wasn't alone. Two other survivors stood behind him, both armed with makeshift weapons, one with a baseball bat, the other with a large kitchen knife. Jason's mind raced. The group was outnumbered, and if they didn't handle this carefully, it could end badly. "You've got something we need," the man said, his voice low and calm, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "Hand over the food, and we'll let you walk away." Jason tightened his grip on the crowbar. "We're not looking for trouble," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We just need to survive." The man chuckled darkly, the sound harsh and hollow. "In this world, everyone's just trying to survive. But you're gonna have to pay the price for it." Jason glanced quickly at Luke and Sarah. They didn't have the numbers to fight, but they weren't about to give up without a struggle. His mind raced for options, knowing that one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. "Listen," Jason said, trying to keep his tone even, "we don't want to fight. We just need food and supplies. We can work something out." The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "I don't think so. You have something we want, and I'm not leaving without it." Jason took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a simple negotiation, it was a test of survival. In a world like this, trust was a dangerous game. And now, the price of that trust was about to be paid. The tension in the air was unbearable. The strangers' group stood at the doorway, blocking the only exit. Jason's mind raced as he calculated the best course of action. They were outnumbered, and while he wasn't afraid to fight, they didn't have the luxury of time or resources. Every second counted. Luke shifted nervously behind Jason, clearly uncomfortable with the standoff. Sarah, on the other hand, was silent, her eyes narrowed, watching the strangers carefully. Jason knew they couldn't afford to be caught in a dangerous situation. But there was no easy way out. "We don't want to fight," Jason repeated, his voice steady, though his insides were a mess of nerves. We can share the supplies. We don't have to do this. The man with the baseball bat, a burly, unshaven figure, scoffed. You think I'm just gonna trust you? No way. We've seen enough people like you, thinking they can just walk away with what's ours. Jason's hand tightened on the crowbar. He had to think fast. There was no way they were leaving here without confrontation, but a direct fight would be risky. The store wasn't big enough to maneuver easily, and they were already running low on supplies. A prolonged battle wouldn't work in their favor. He glanced at Sarah and Luke, then back at the strangers. His heart pounded in his chest as he came to a decision. All right, Jason said, his voice dropping to a calm but firm tone. Here's the deal. We don't have much to give, but we'll trade you what we have. You take the food, and we'll be on our way. We won't cause any trouble. No one needs to get hurt. The man with the knife shifted his weight, clearly considering Jason's offer. He exchanged a look with the burly one, and the two men seemed to silently communicate for a moment. The tension hung heavy in the room, the silence almost suffocating. Jason didn't let his guard down. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to react at a moment's notice. Finally, the man with the baseball bat grunted. You think I'm stupid? You really think we'll just let you go after you've got what we need? His eyes flickered toward the small pile of canned goods Jason had collected. You're gonna have to pay the price for taking what doesn't belong to you. Jason's stomach twisted. This wasn't going the way he'd hoped. They weren't going to let them walk away easily. The man was growing impatient, and it was only a matter of time before they escalated this into violence. Listen, Jason said, his voice low but firm, you can take what we have, but if you attack us, you're making a mistake. We're not as defenseless as you think. Luke and Sarah stood behind him, but they didn't have the same weapons as the strangers. Luke had a knife tucked in his belt, and Sarah had a small wrench she'd found, but neither of them was a match for the bat or the knife. The man with the bat smirked. Big words for someone who's cornered. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Jason's. I think you've forgotten where you are. This is the world we live in now, eat or be eaten. And right now, you're on the menu. Jason didn't have the luxury of waiting any longer. He took a step back, his hand reaching for the small, rusted wrench Sarah had found for him the previous day. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. He was ready to fight if it came to that. The man with the bat swung it lazily, as if testing Jason's reaction. He wasn't ready to strike just yet, but the threat was clear. The other two survivors stood back, waiting for the signal to move in. They thought they had control, but Jason wasn't about to let them intimidate him. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the store, followed by a series of shuffling footsteps. Jason's heart skipped a beat as the sound of moaning filled the air. The undead were close. Too close. For a moment, the tension in the room seemed to freeze. The stranger's eyes widened in realization. The groaning grew louder, and the unmistakable shuffle of zombie feet reached their ears. They were running out of time. Damn it, the man with the baseball bat muttered, spinning around to look toward the back of the store. We've got company. Before Jason could react, the door to the stockroom crashed open, and several zombies stumbled out into the store. Their grotesque forms lurched toward the living, their eyes glazed and hungry. The survivors immediately shifted their focus from Jason and his group to the new threat. Shit, the man with the knife muttered, stepping backward as the zombies advanced. He raised the knife, swinging it wildly at the nearest undead, but it was clear they were outmatched. There were too many zombies to deal with, and the survivors didn't have the weapons or the numbers to fight back effectively. Jason didn't wait for them to make the first move. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the exit. Now, move, he shouted, motioning for Luke to follow. The group bolted toward the front door, pushing past the survivors in their haste to escape. As they rushed through the door, Jason glanced over his shoulder, watching as the two groups collided with the horde of zombies. The survivors were fighting back, but their efforts were futile. It didn't matter how hard they swung the bat or how many zombies they stabbed with the knife, there were too many of them. The sound of screams filled the air, but Jason didn't look back. They were alive for now, and that was all that mattered. They ran down the street, breathing heavily as they tried to put as much distance between themselves and the store. Jason's heart was racing, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. They had to find a place to regroup, a place to survive. As they turned a corner and the store was finally out of sight, Jason stopped, panting for breath. He looked at Sarah and Luke, who were both out of breath, their faces pale. "That was too close," Sarah said, her voice shaky. Jason nodded, his gaze distant. "We're not safe yet. But we're alive. For now." They had made it out of the store, but the world outside was just as dangerous. The fight for survival was far from over. And Jason knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The street was eerily quiet as Jason, Luke, and Sarah sprinted away from the chaos of the grocery store. The shuffling moans of the undead echoed faintly in the distance, but there was no sign of immediate danger, for now. They had narrowly escaped a deadly confrontation with the strangers, who were now swarmed by the undead, and as much as Jason wanted to take a moment to breathe, he knew they couldn't afford to stop. "Where do we go now?" Sarah gasped, wiping sweat from her brow as they slowed to a jog. Her eyes darted around, constantly scanning for threats, but it was clear the shock from the close call was beginning to set in. Jason took a deep breath, his mind still spinning with what had just happened. The adrenaline was still coursing through him, and his body ached from the tension of the encounter. "We need to get to high ground. Somewhere we can see if anyone's following us. Maybe a building with a rooftop access. We can't keep running forever." Luke nodded, looking over his shoulder nervously. "But we've been running from the dead and people alike. How do we know we'll be safe anywhere?" Jason stopped in his tracks, turning to face them both. He could see the uncertainty on their faces. The same fear that had haunted him from the beginning was creeping into their eyes now. He couldn't blame them, they'd been through a lot in a short amount of time. But this wasn't the time for hesitation. "We keep moving forward," Jason said firmly. "We make it work. We find somewhere to stay, figure out what we can do to survive." His voice softened, but only slightly. "We can't afford to be caught in a corner again. If we stop, we die." Sarah gave him a hesitant nod, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. Luke seemed to accept the harsh reality of it too, though his jaw was tight with the stress of their constant survival mode. They had no choice but to press on. They began moving again, keeping to the alleys and avoiding main roads where they could be easily spotted by both zombies and hostile survivors. Jason's mind kept replaying the images from the store, the way the survivors had turned on them so quickly, their desperation, and how it had cost them. It was a cruel reminder of how unpredictable the world had become. Eventually, after what felt like hours of moving through desolate streets, they reached a small office building, tall, but abandoned. The windows were shattered, and the door was ajar, as though it had been looted long ago. Still, the structure seemed stable enough for a quick rest, and more importantly, it gave them height. The three of them cautiously entered the building, keeping quiet as they moved through the dark hallways. The sound of their footsteps was muted by the thick dust and debris that had accumulated over the past months. Jason led the way, always listening for the telltale sounds of undead or other survivors who might have gotten there first. But the building was empty, for now. They reached the rooftop door, and Jason hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The door creaked loudly, echoing into the silence. He winced, hoping they hadn't attracted unwanted attention. Once outside, they moved toward the edge, peering over the railing. From their vantage point, they could see the entire neighborhood below. In the distance, the outlines of the city stood like a dark silhouette against the dimming sky. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and Jason's throat tightened as he took it all in. What was left of civilization lay in ruin. "We should rest," Luke said, his voice low but fatigued. "We've been on the move all day. We can plan tomorrow." Jason nodded, though his mind was still racing. "We'll rest, but only for a few hours. We need to keep moving. The more we stay in one place, the more likely we are to get cornered. Sarah sat on the edge of the roof, her legs hanging over the side. She stared into the distance, lost in thought. How much longer can we keep doing this? Running. Hiding. Every day's just another fight to survive. Jason watched her for a moment, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, but he didn't have an answer. He couldn't tell her that they were any closer to finding safety because, deep down, he didn't know if such a place even existed anymore. All they had now was each other, and even that felt fragile. We keep going, Jason said, more to himself than to Sarah or Luke. We survive, day by day. It's the only way. As night fell, the sounds of the city seemed to grow more intense. The moans of the undead became clearer, closer. Jason's instincts told him that the horde was near, but from their elevated position, they had a better chance of spotting danger before it got too close. He scanned the area, but no movement caught his eye. For now, the danger was still a distant threat. The three of them sat in silence for a while, watching the fading light as they caught their breath. Jason thought back to the days before the world had changed. A time when survival had been about finding a good job, a comfortable home, and a future that stretched out before him. Now, it was about finding a way to live in a world that no longer made sense. A low groan drifted up from the streets below, followed by several more. The undead were restless tonight. Jason knew they had to stay sharp. I'm not going to let this world beat us, Jason finally said, standing up and turning to look at Luke and Sarah. We've come too far. We'll find a way. But we have to stick together. Luke nodded, his face grim but resolute. You're right. We're not done yet. Sarah stood up as well, dusting off her pants. We keep moving. No matter what. Jason smiled, though it was small and filled with uncertainty. We keep moving. As the last of the daylight faded, Jason knew that the next day would bring new challenges, new dangers, and possibly new opportunities. But as long as they had each other, as long as they could keep fighting, they would find a way to survive. For now, that was enough. And that was the only thing keeping them alive.